Welcome. I know you can't respond to me, but I'm very happy that you've joined us this evening. My name is Gahonde Horn-Miller. I'm the Assistant Vice President of Indigenous Initiatives here at Carleton University. Some of you may be former students of mine. I'm also an Associate Professor in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies. I'm joined tonight by Julie Ariel-Lalonde, my assistant in the AVP office, Patrick Champagne, our wonderful tech behind the scenes, and of course, Tasha Beeds. Now, this lecture that you'll be hearing tonight by Tasha Beeds is part of an ongoing series as part of Ānako Indigenous Research Institute. Now, the Institute is a new and evolving entity at Carleton, and it comes out of the Ānako final report, the Learning Together report that came out in May of 2020. Now, in that, as part of that lead up to the final report, we did, my co-chairs and I, Benny Michaud and Jerry Tomberlin, did numerous consultations across campus with the Ottawa Indigenous community, with members of Pikwakanagan, Kitigan-Zibi, Agwazasne, to find out how best can we make Carleton more of a welcoming place for Indigenous learners and as well as scholars. And having an institute came to be one of the things that we realized through these consultations, because many times we have students and we have faculty wanting to do research with Indigenous peoples. So what we did was we said, okay, so what can this look like? So when I took on the position of Assistant Vice President, one of my responsibilities was to begin to get this going. So tonight, we have our inaugural visiting scholar, which will be an annual part of the Ānako initiatives, Tasha Beeds. She's going to be with us she started in September and she'll be with us until the end of April. And right now she's doing a number of research talks with us that you'll be able to view online. Here, we are also recording this lecture so that it can be housed on the Ānako website and made available for you as a teaching tool, as a learning tool. That is part of our mandate as Ānako, is to ensure that we build a community around doing ethical research with Indigenous communities and peoples. So this fits right in with the big picture on what Ānako is all about. So I'd like to introduce Tasha. She's an Indigenous scholar. Some of you might have seen her in the news or on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram. She posts widely on her work as a water walker. Tasha is of mixed heritage, Plains Cree, Scottish Métis, Bajan. She's also a creative artist, a poet, and a grandmother and a Médewiin scholar or a practitioner. Now, her artistic and research endeavors are really connected to the notion of community, ethics, and responsibility that are integral to us as Indigenous peoples. And in this, her message is very simple. She says, Indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world have survived, are of value, and need to be shared to help not only Indigenous people, but all people as well, as in our traditional territories. It is imperative for the existence of our future generations that we as Indigenous people continue to give voice to the experiences of our people, our lands, and our waters. And so with that, her teaching and her research areas are about Indigenous literatures, storytelling, oral tradition, Indigenous knowledge, intellectual traditions and philosophies, gender relations, and relationships to the lands and waters and creation, Indigenous legal traditions, Indigenous community engagement and resistance. She has recently completed 2 water walks, one local to the Sudbury North Shore region and one nationally for the Saskatchewan River. She's also won multiple awards, which is, of course she has. She's a prolific scholar and community engaged researcher, and is known widely for sharing her views, perspectives, and her energies. So welcome, Tasha. I just want to give you a little heads up on how this will take place. Tasha will speak with us for about half an hour, 45 minutes. And you'll see the button at the very bottom. It's a Q&A button. And we invite you to post your questions there, and I will read them out to her. You can post your greetings too, if that's all you want to do. That's perfectly fine. And we welcome you. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and welcome, Tasha.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? Am I good? Yeah, perfect. I'm really honored to be here with Kahente and with Julie and our tech person and all of you as well. I'm just going to go right into, I have a PowerPoint for you. So we're going to see how that's going to work. I'm going to set that up. And so I think if I share my screen, and then I'll give us, you'll see through some imagery and some other kind of dynamic things what I have to share with you tonight. Before I even do that, I think I would invite you all to ground yourself in whatever way that feels good for you. So maybe you need a cup of tea, maybe you need to have a blanket, maybe you need to smudge. I'm holding an eagle fan because that grounds me, and I also had a smudge. So whatever way you follow, whatever feels right for you. If you do have a smudge available, I do suggest people smudge before my talks, simply because of the nature of what I'm going to be sharing. Sometimes it invokes the spirit. And so whatever that is for you, however you ground yourself into being, I would invite you to take a few moments to do that while I set up the presenter view. So this is, my presentation is called Through the Lens of the Water, Indigenous Research Methods. And I have a number of different hats. I'm also the visiting scholar at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law, and I'm also a lecturer at the University of Saskatchewan, along with being a Midday and a water walker. And I was recently elected as a sovereign future Indigenous environmental leader outside of a Seattle-based organization called Na'ali, which is run by a number of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit folk. And so I'm really excited to share with you a little bit about who I am and what it is that I do and what I bring with the voice of the water as well. That's who I'm representing. But before we do that, as many of us from Indigenous nations and Indigenous communities know, one of the first things that we do is we do an introduction or first words. And part of that is to ground ourselves in our ancestral lands and territories. And so with that, I hail from the Treaty 6 territory of the Nahiawak. I'm Nahiawak. I'm a Plains Cree woman. I hail from the lands of what is known in English as the Treaty 6 territories, specifically from a Métis community called Ānako, Ātakakup, and Mistawasis. And these are the territories of my ancestors. These are the lands and the waters of my people, and where I fully ground myself. They are connected to me through those lands and waters. They embody the lands and waters. And when I was born, they were born again through me. And I'm fortunate enough to be a kokum. So I have two granddaughters. And that ancestral legacy that reaches into our present and moves into the future is so pivotal. My very ancestors tie me to everything I do. I'm never alone. I'm always with them. And, as a grandmother, my two granddaughters are connected through those ancestral lines, but also through the lands and waters themselves and all the spirits that exist in our respective home territories. When I entered the world, I entered through the portal of my ancestors. And because of that, those connections, no matter what happens, they can never be severed. They're with us always. We are literally never alone. If you have any type of Indigenous ancestry, those ancestors can come to you. And so, as I make my way through my own lands, particularly on the Saskatchewan River Water Walk, I knew I was walking in the footsteps of my ancestors in the way that they traveled the land. My Mushimuk were men of the land, and my Nukos, my grandfathers and grandmothers, my grandmothers were keepers of the land. And so their bones rest in the prairie grasses, and they are embodied inside that landscape. And this is why we'll go to any ends to protect our respective territories. I learned about as a Nihiawa Squel, a Plains Cree woman, through time spent on the lands and waters of my ancestors. I learned about them through, as I drove with my mushum and kokum on the back of the truck, and we went picking blueberries, when I fished and hunted with my uncles, although my uncles always said that I was much too chatty to be a good hunter, because I didn't know how to be quiet in the bush. So, but my formative years were really, really grounded inside that space of land, water, and Cree people ancestors. And part of that, when we're thinking about Indigenous methods and we're thinking about Indigenous ways of being, part of what that is remembering who our ancestors are, remembering where we come from, and also telling those future generations. Those connections are pivotal. And in Cree, we call that wagotuin. We call that the ways we're connected to each other and the rest of creation. That is so beyond important, because without those ties, we can end up getting lost. We can end up not being able to find our way. And I think when we look at the reflections of where our people are, and again, across the board, no matter what Indigenous nation that we're talking about, when we look at that reflection of our people, it's a very difficult one. It's something that, we do have the highest statistics in everything that, in all the statistics that come forward, we're there always, it seems. And so it's a very difficult, a difficult space to be in when we recognize that. And so part of what we do when we think through Indigenous methodologies is that we recognize that we do still have and contain all of the knowledge and the intellectual legacies that our ancestors left us with. We weren't destroyed. We wouldn't be sitting here in front of you today if we were. And so, a lot of work has been done, both within the context of Indigenous scholarship within academia, but also within the context of grassroots people too, right? It was grassroots people who began, it was elders who began Indigenous studies as a discipline, right? We look back to the early people like Edna Manitowoc, Jim Dumont, Maria Campbell, Howard Adams, like most of the people who had those early formative years inside of our discipline, they were grassroots Indigenous people, and they were working from within the nations. And so today we do recognize that, we do have keys, and they do have the power to break that silence and bring forth our own perspectives, our own ways of knowing. And we do that through different doorways, languages being one of them. I'm not a fluent Cree speaker, and so, I'm cognizant of that's a key that we need. One of the things that I've been promoting lately is this idea of we need language speakers who think through the lens of their particular respective nations. And that sounds relatively simple, but a lot of our people, a lot of our elders have been interrupted. That knowledge has been interrupted through processes designed to eradicate us, like the residential school system. And so to find people who have received that line of knowledge without that interruption is key, I think. And I think of my colleague, Sylvia McAdam Sesuehum. Sylvia is a very unique scholar in that she's been trained within the Western discipline. She's actually one of my role models as well, because she's a fluent Cree speaker, and her parents didn't go to residential school. And so you have a line of knowledge there and an understanding of the language. She's able to think through that Cree lens. And I think it's possible for all of us to learn how to do that, to decolonize ourselves to the point where we can, but we need those original speakers to help us do that. And yeah, that's a huge concern of mine, and not to take away from people who have gone through those systems, but those ones that have a different type of knowledge to offer. And I think we need to ensure that we train with those ones as well as all the other speakers. So yeah, because most of our knowledge has been filtered through that, what I'll call that Western lens. And our consciousness, our actual consciousness, for me, I'm speaking from that Plains Cree perspective, but whether it be Haudenosaunee or Anishinaabe or Dene or whatever our diverse nations are, we're all colonized. Like we all are impacted by that filter, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so, that it's an active battle, I would say, for us to continue to take that filter off and put our own lenses on. Because when we put our own lenses, when we peer through Cree consciousness or Haudenosaunee consciousness or Dene or Anishinaabe, when we peer through Indigenous consciousness, it's very, very different. And that Western filter, of course, is served to subjugate us and disempower. And that's an active goal. People think colonization is a thing of the past, but no, it's still an active agent, and it's a system, right? It's not one singular individual, it's a system, and it's a system that generates a particular thought about how we are to exist in the world. And so for Indigenous peoples who, that eye has been open, so to speak, it is truly a constant battle to recognize us. We have been subjects of study for years and years, since, even before our discipline emerged, the discipline of Indigenous studies emerged through other disciplines. We have constantly been subjects of study, and we still are. When you look at indigenization and a lot of universities, unfortunately, indigenization isn't always genuine, because what we see are non-Indigenous people holding positions of power. And what we have here at Carleton is very unique in that Ente has that honor. We need to see that occurring across our institutions, not our institutions, but non-Indigenous institutions. If they're genuine about indigenization, you need to put Indigenous people in places of power within those systems, because we are creators of study. We're not just subjects. We are creators of study. And this is probably one of the most exciting things that I've experienced in my own learning journey, which began in academia, but came out and brought me into the lodge and into the water. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. But it's really important for all of people to recognize that we're not just subjects. We actually create. We create knowledge. We create building upon those ancestral legacies. It's a really exciting time to be Indigenous. And of course, that lens leads us to our own sovereignty, right? We do have that power, and we do have those intellectual legacies and bundles and knowledge and ways of coming to know that have been carefully preserved and protected by our respective peoples. And so, when we start creating study, then we become even more sovereign, because we have control over the dissemination of our stories. And our research methods and methodologies are as old as our ceremonies and our nations. It's not like, Western academia came along and taught us something. We already knew. They've always been with us. And as Cardinal says, our Indigenous cultures are rich with ways of gathering, discovering, and uncovering knowledge. They are as near as our dreams and as close as our relationships. And so that's really, really pivotal to understand. Our way of coming to know, and some of you may be familiar, right? But we come to know our ways through different methods, story as a method, ceremonies. And you hear that word now, and it means something different to each nation. And there's so many different Indigenous nations. We can't be lumped into one kind of umbrella. However, we do have commonalities. So there are threads that tie us from nation to nation, such as, being on the lands and waters equals a way of knowing. Circle work, singing, dancing, fasting, getting to know the land, the beings that exist within the land, and not just the beings that you can see, but the ones that don't always show themselves. Our stories are filled with those entities. And for us to think that, that it's somehow mythical, which is what that Western narrative has tried to make us believe, that it's not true, it's mythical, they're not real. But those of us who have done that work and entered into those spaces, because you have to do the work in order to get to a certain doorway. It's like multiple doorways. It might not come to you right away, that knowledge, that what we might call Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous methods. It's hard work. It's the hardest work I've ever done in my life, in fact. And there's risk to that. There's risk to opening ourselves up as in, because we do have a power that's connected to the sacred or the spiritual or what have you. And they belong to our respective nations. There's some things that I would never be able to share in this forum, right? I have to go to my lodge, or I have to go to the land or to the water in order to share that. And so when we move into these realms, there's risk there, because they may be misused. They might be used with malice, or unintentionally, or maybe unintentionally. And our ways of being and knowing in the world, like, there's caution there. In Anishinaabe, they say, "Amguamazin," be careful how you walk. Because there's certain things that have been protected, not just for the well-being of our own people, but for the well-being of those who may not know the power that they're tapping into. And then there's also that protective element. So much has been taken from us and appropriated and used to profit from. And so, we do have to protect what we have left, because they are the keys that are going to ensure our survival as Indigenous nations. They've ensured our survival for this long. I was going to share a poem, but I think I'm going to skip the poem for tonight. So how I came to know and to learn some of that power that's contained inside of our ways of knowing and being. And again, it's risky, because I share parts of myself within these spaces. And that's something that we, as Indigenous scholars and researchers and grassroots people, that's something that we can't divorce ourselves from. And so, I came to the water through trauma, through some serious, heavy trauma that was very, very difficult. And I'm sure some of you may have read it and known, and I'm not going to go into it this evening. But like many other Indigenous peoples and communities, I come from a place of poverty, a place of violence, a place of addictions, and, some severe trauma. Living as a brown, Black Indigenous woman in small town Saskatchewan, my daily existence was somehow seen as a threat, even as a child. And so, when you navigate those spaces, it's difficult. And we come to the doors of academia of us through those spaces of trauma. And so, we arrive in this world that, and I mean, I've been in academia for 20 years. So when I go back 20 years, it was much more hostile than it is now. We've created spaces like Ānako and other Indigenous spaces where it's safer, but there's still that isolation that can occur for Indigenous students, particularly. And for non-Indigenous students, there's often that when they come to that place of knowing, there's often anger and grief as well, because a lot of students just don't know, a lot of people just don't know the history of our respective Indigenous nations and the country they call Canada. So, coming to the water through that place of trauma, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know fully. I hadn't been trained as within a spiritual or ceremonial context. I wasn't Midewiwin at that point. And I came upon, we talk about dreams and we talk about dreaming and we talk about that as a research method. And I think it's really important for people to hear the story of how I became a water walker. I'm Plains Cree, so there's not a lot of water where I come from. I mean, there's a lot of plains and there is water, but nothing like the Great Lakes. And so, one of my coping mechanisms, I quit drinking and I quit doing drugs in the early 2000s. By 2008, I was completely sober and clean and have been ever since. But one of my coping mechanisms was to walk. And I want you to keep this image. This is a being, and his name is Mishabishu, and he's affiliated with Lake Superior and traditions. My life experiences landed me in the Anishinaabeg territories of the Mississauga Nation, which is down by Peterborough. And I used to walk every day. I had a German Shepherd named Thunder whom I walked with every day. And I had this dream of this being. And at the time I dreamt of him, I didn't understand who he was. He was actually all dried up and he was laying, there's this collapsing with dream and lived and realness, I guess is what you want, however you want to call the real world and the dream world. And you find this when you do go into certain ceremonies like fasting. But I dreamt of this big cat and he was laying just as you see him. He was on his side and the landscape was all dried and cracked. And I, having gone through some of that trauma, I have this huge sense of empathy and so I was very empathetic, and I was so moved by this creature, this being, and I didn't know who he was. I had no concept. And I woke up and I took Thunder for a walk, and in real time I actually saw what I saw in my dream. So I don't know what happened there. I don't have full explanation, but I went back to my elders and in my Plains Cree people, and we're like, do we have this big cat in our stories? Like, who is this? And they're like, oh, we don't know. Go back and see those Ojibways. And so I was just starting the PhD program at that time and at Trent University, and they had a number of elders affiliated with the program, Edna Manitowabi, Doug Williams, and Shirley Williams. And so I called each of them, and they're like, oh, that's Mishabishu. Like he's the one who protects the waters. He's one of those water beings, one of the first ones, one of the primary Minidus that the Anishinaabe look to. And so I was like, oh, okay, like this is big. And again, I didn't have much training, but I had enough to know that I wanted to offer him something and let him know that I would help him. And this is one of those things that I always tell students, be careful before you make movement, like, because I didn't know at the time what I was doing, but I went and I offered some berries and some tobacco to him. And I made that vow without fully understanding what it meant. But that tobacco and that offering acts as a sacred contract, right? Almost like it's part of our natural law. And so I created a bind, if you will. I bound myself to this being. But I was so moved. I was like, I'll help you. And the message he said I was supposed to share was that they need us. Like all of these entities need us. The water needs us. The earth needs us. And they're dying. That was the message. And I was like taken aback, but I I was like, I will help you. No matter what, I'll remember this. I will continue to, I will help you. I will find a way to help you. And the very next day, right, after I had made that commitment, and again, when it comes to our natural understandings, our intellectual legacies, our stories, and our teachings, those customs, there's layers and layers and layers to them. So you're not just offering tobacco, you're creating a connection that can't be. And if you renege on that contract, much like in Western law, there's going to be consequences. But I was willing, to do whatever. He just moved me so much. And the very next day, a woman by the name of Liz Ozwamik came, knocked on my door, and she was from a lodge, a Midewin lodge, and it's the one that I became a part of in 2014. It's called Minwewig and Midewin Lodge. And there are a number of Midewin lodges across Turtle Island. Ours is specific to Roseau River, and Wigwam have 2 lodges now. The most common and one of the larger ones is known as the Three Fires Lodge. And when Liz returned, she was explaining to me that she was walking for the water. And she asked me, she's like, do you want to come? And she explained what it meant. And I was like, oh, this is it. This is what I'm supposed to do. Because if I raise consciousness about the water, then I'm going to raise consciousness about those entities. And so we began to walk, and I met my greatest teacher, one of my greatest teachers, the late Bidasage Ba, or the late Josephine Mendaman. And she was, of course, one of the original water walkers. And she says, she always used to say, when you see someone walking with a pail of water, you wonder, where's she going with that water? So the message is water is very precious. And she used to say, I'll go to any lengths to and direction to carry water to the people. As women, we are carriers of the water. We carry life for the people. And, this beautiful, humble, powerful Anishinaabe Kwe. Sorry, I'm going to get emotional. But, she walked all around the Great Lakes. She walked the Mississippi. And the thing is, she was walking for all of you, even those of you that never met her. She was walking for your children, your grandchildren, your future generations. And, I remembered that I had made that vow to Mishibiju, and so I made a vow to the water in similar fashion that I would follow, and I would learn from Bidasage Ba. And so I began to walk with her. I began to walk in 2008 with Liz. She was my first, and then she introduced me to Josephine Ba. And, water walking as a method is something that a lot of people don't fully understand until they do it. And it's not just walking, and it's not just, there are certain protocols put in place to activate the spirit in a way that knowledge can come through. We walked all around the Great Lakes. The very first major walk that I did with Josephine Ba was in 2015, and it was known as the Sacred Water Walk. And it started in Matane, Quebec, and we walked all the way to Duluth, Minnesota, stopping at the places where the Anishinaabe have migrated from the east to the west. Like, they knew before settlers arrived that settlers were coming. They knew through our own ways of knowing. And so this particular walk was to raise consciousness for the water, but also to, retrace those footsteps of our ancestors. And again, you come to the land in a different way when you're walking. One of our understandings is that water contains the memories of our ancestors. And so when you're carrying that water and you're walking and you're in that, it's a ceremony. It's not just a physical endeavor. You're walking emotionally, spiritually, physically, and mentally. And so you're carrying that water. We lift it up from the source. So wherever that original source. So for the North Saskatchewan River, for instance, I had to travel to the glaciers, like where the mouth of the river start, where the river begins to flow. And we pick up and then we walk. So we pick up that original water, and that's the water that along the length of the river. And we carry it with an eagle staff. And it's always been mostly women. Very few men have shown up. There's been a few, but by and two spirit people than we do men. But one of the young men who took it upon himself to also do the work for the water is a young man by the name of Wasakum. And Wasakum, he canoed the Great Lakes. And I helped him in 2016. He did a canoe journey from Kettle Point all the way up to Garden River. And so again, when you're in a canoe on the Great Lakes, it's quite, and at that point it took him 30 days. And again, it's another ceremony. And then in 2017, we started in Duluth and we went backwards to Matan, and that one was called For the Earth and Water Walk 2017. And that was Josephine's last major water walk. She ended up getting very sick. And, I look back and I think about all that she sacrificed and that her family sacrificed. And, having done two of my own water walks for the first time and understanding the weight of that journey, I can see, I'm forever indebted to her, and I know she's still with us. Yeah, she's still with us. We also did 7 water walks in the Kawarthas. Those were headed by Liz Oswamick and Shirley Williams. Shirley Williams is another elder, and Josephine came to almost every one of those water walks with us too. And so, and again, it sounds so simple. You're walking for the water. And traditionally the women carry the water because we're the ones who give life. And so that water is carried in a copper vessel because, again, our stories tell us about that copper being animate. And we have an eagle staff. Traditionally, again, it's that male's role or the two-spirit role to carry that eagle staff. And the eagle staff is the protector of the water and the woman. And so when you're carrying, and this is what makes part of one of the ceremonial protocols, and I can share this one, is that when you're carrying that water, you never look back and you can never come to a stop. And so that sounds really, but you can't glance behind you. Doesn't matter if you hear, one of those big, huge semis coming up next to you, or you got people honking at you, or you hear dogs coming out. You cannot look backwards. That was drilled into us. And so but the eagle staff carrier can. So if you have that man or that two spirit or that gender fluid person with you as that protector and that carrier, that staff carrier has the ability to move in ways that you as the water carrier can't. And it's echoing our life, right? It's echoing our role as mothers and that role as men as protectors. And so, but when there's not enough men, then we as women do both. We carry both the water and the staff. So then your hands are full. You only have one hand to carry that water, and you've got your other hand on the staff, and you can't look backwards, and you can't stop. And so, it sounds relatively simple, but it becomes quite challenging when you're moving through cities like Toronto or Montreal, and you can't come to a stop even though there's a red light. And there's different techniques to keep the flow going. My first water walk was the NJ Tibeasung Nibe Nikwe Juam. It was a 4-day water walk for Junction Creek. And I think this one is one of the most fitting ones that explain how Indigenous research methods have come to be, or it articulates a way. So in 2017, I fasted along with other members of the water. That's one of our protocols and our methods and a way of finding out information. And when I fasted in 2017, I was visited by 7 children. It was a winter fast. So that opens different doorways for Nihiwak and Anishinaabe. So I went for 4 days without food or water. And when those children visited me, I didn't know who they were. I'm not going to go into the full articulation of what happened, but they were 7 children from residential schools, and they were trapped, that they were caught, and they were asking me for help. And I didn't know who they were, and I didn't know where they had come from, but I knew that I would help, and they gave me something in exchange for me to share their story, that they in the experience I could see how each child had been murdered, and it was very difficult. It was a very difficult thing to bear witness to. And so, I told them I would share their story. They had indicated that they could see the ancestors on one side, but they were in between, like they couldn't pass through. And when I saw them, it was like almost like a shimmery. And the way they showed me how they had been killed, it was like a reflection. I looked into the sky and I could see their reflections of how each child passed away. And when I came out of the fast and I shared, they had told me that they had been deliberately placed in this space because those who had done that harm were afraid. They were afraid that those children would come back and haunt them or something along those lines. And so, for a good year, we shared that story. I shared that story at ceremonies, and I shared it in public spaces. And then I kind of forgot about it. And then in 2000, in the summer, early fall of 2020, my nephew, one of my lodge nephews, his name is Pitwe, he went and did a fast too. He was only 7 years old, and he did a one day, one night fast, and he came out, and there was something that he shared that prompted me to feel like I needed to fast again. And so I fasted again at the end of October, inspired by this young man and his sacrifice for the people. And so I fasted on Manitoulin Island, and we'd already walked I'd already walked for that body of water. And so I felt like I knew that water, and that water knew me, because we see the water as a living entity. And when I came, it was out of that fast that this water walk emerged. I was told to do 2 walks. And so the first one I chose was Junction Creek, and then the second was the Saskatchewan River. Those were the 2 bodies of water that were speaking to me. And so when I went to, I made the offer to do Junction Creek, and those of you familiar with, maybe you're not familiar with Northern Ontario, but Junction Creek runs right through the city of Sudbury. And I was like, I thought it was only a day. I thought it began at the front of the city and ended at the city limits. And I went to a farmer's market, and I ran into people from the Junction Creek Stewardship Committee, and they were a group of non-Indigenous people who'd been trying to clean up Junction Creek for years and years, and they've been doing all this work. And I was like, oh, hey, I'm going to try to clean up that river spiritually too. And they were intrigued. And so we ended up having a partnership. So I partnered with them to get this water walk going. I said, okay, first thing I need to know is, where does this water, like, where does it begin and where does it end? And they said, oh, it begins at Garson. Turns out the aquifer that is Junction Creek sits, the Garson mine sits on top of the aquifer. It sits on top of the aquifer, and they've rerouted the water through pipes. So that was the first kind of, oh my goodness, like, how can this be, like, all the life that depends on that river. And so it was a really startling kind of realization. I think for many people, no one really questioned, no one thought about it until, we as the water walkers, started saying, this goes right through. And then he said, and I was like, oh, and so it just ends outside of the city of Sudbury. And he's like, actually, no, it ends in Spanish. And so it just, I was like, oh my goodness. And I remembered those 7 children, and I was like, that's it. Right. So the water that brought those children to my awareness in 2017 came back in 2020 to remind me, like, we'd made this commitment. And so that water, Junction Creek, flows from Garson. Again, when you think about that, really think about that for a minute. The mine sits on top of the water that flows into the Spanish River, which flows into Lake Huron, right? And so all of that material that's coming from that mine is connecting and finding its way into one of the Great Lakes. And beyond that, the water's flow ended right beside Spanish residential school. And so I knew immediately that was the connection. And with the Midday, when we ended up, and this was well before the 215, we started planning back in October of 2020 to do this. And so we planned a ceremony to acknowledge the ones who had not been found and who had been murdered. And so we did a full ceremony right on the grounds where the boys' school was, and we did what they had asked me. And so that was just one way, right? So there was all of this connection that came through. And the Saskatchewan River Water Walk is still occurring. We do, when we make the commitment to do a water walk, we do 4 so for a total of 4 years. So the Saskatchewan River Water Walk, we began at the base of the Rocky Mountains, and we made it. I was intending to go to Lake Winnipeg, but the situation became so heavy and challenging that we ended up stopping at a place called the Saskatchewan River Forks, which is where the north and the south, and you can kind of see it in the, like right here. That's where we ended. So we walked from the mountains, base of the mountains, through Saskatchewan, or through Alberta, Saskatchewan, and it was 1,100 kilometers. And there was no water. That was the message. That's one of the first messages that we're receiving. We were visited by 7 bears, and those bears were starving because there was no berries, there was no medicines for them, and it was so hot. Those 36 days, we only saw one downpour in Musqueam, and that was only for 10 minutes. And we had one day of kind of like a misty rain, 2 days of a misty rain, one in the mountains and one in the prairies. But other than that, there was no water. And the mountain streams were dry. There was no snow on the mountains. And the entire landscape was just dry. There were fires coming up behind us. And it was the land itself, it was like the land was drinking from us. And the animals and even the little butterflies and the insects, they would crawl into that pail of water that we were carrying because there was just like everything was dried up. So whatever happens in this aquifer is going to eventually make its way. It was quite a frightening message. And I guess one of the things that we acknowledge is that we are in the sacred times, and as water walkers, we are that walking medicine. And we are carrying the memories of our ancestors, and the information that we receive on a spiritual level, on a pragmatic level. It's a gaze that remembers that time before colonialism. And that's what we reenact it's not even reenacting, it's living. It's living our ancestors. It's a living research, if that makes sense. The last thing that I want to share with you before I bring the talk to a close, and it was kind of a culmination of both, and what I believe is that's contained by Shkakamekwe, Gawinawaski, or Mother Earth, and Nipi, Nibe, and all of creation. And as humans, I think we feel that grief, but many of us don't know what to do. But I wrote, and I'll share this poem with you, because it connects back to remembering that we have our own laws and our own obligations to the waters, lands, to all of humans. And we have laws about the water that go back to our respective creation stories. And so I always urge people, pick up those ancestral bundles. And for non-Indigenous people, I urge you to create the space for us to do the work, because our work, I think, is it's part of the key for our collective future generations. People ask, like, as a grandmother, I didn't want to walk. Like, people say, how did you become a walker? I've walked almost 7,000 kilometers now, and it's not something that I enter into. Like, it's not like, yay, I'm going to go do a water walk. No. It's, I'd rather have my feet up at the cottage playing with my grandchildren. The Saskatchewan River Water Walk took us 36 days, 1,100 kilometers. And so all summer, basically, I was gone. I didn't see my family. You know, you don't have the creature comforts of your bed. We slept in a van, and we get no funding, right? We actually, well, that's not true. We did get support from the Indigenous Screen Office and from the Indian Collective out of the down across the medicine line, as well as a few other sponsors. But most of those sponsors came from non-Indigenous people. But the reason I moved for the water is because I do know some of these laws. And in Cree culture, we have a word, and it's Sylvia McAdam taught me this in her book called Nationhood Interrupted, but it's called Otsanewan. And it's when we step over or break Creator's law against anything other than humans. And so when you begin to start to think about that, right, and you begin to think about how much plastic and garbage you see, and I challenge people, I say, next time you're going for a beautiful walk, take a look around. Take a look around, and what do you see? And that's part of what drove me to do the Junction Creek Water Walk, was because of the amount of garbage that I bore witness to. You know, and the pollution of the land is connected to the pollution that's present in the water. And, you know, those grandmothers that, starting with Josephine, who began the water walks because of a prophecy about the water by the late Three Fires chief, Badwewadinba, he made that call. What are you going to do about it? And then that's something that she did. She moved her body. She utilized her body. And those of us coming up after her, we use our bodies as a way of, as a physical connection to that water, and as a physical reminder to creation that we remember who we are. And we remember those natural laws that we are bound by. So I'll finish this off with a poem, and it's kind of a heavy one, but bear with me. I awaken in grief. I awaken in grief, not for those passed on, but for those still here and the ones to come. The babies, the children, the grand, great grand, our collective children. I awaken in grief for the lands, the waters, for the four-leggeds, the winged ones, the swimmers, the crawlers. Creation as we know it, bleeding out. As humanity stares into their screens, pockets their plastics, and drops their garbage without looking up, convenience is better than caring. Snap, Twitter, Gram, Book of Faces, TikTok, time is running out. Documentation of our demise through our own devices. I awaken in grief for my people still wearing a cloak of trauma and hurt, a colonial legacy, a design of degradation, disenfranchisement, disempowerment. Sharing small whispers, knives behind backs, bullies, closed doors, and exclusions, propping up of violence and abuse. Eyes look away, but not at themselves and their complicity. Word arrows slung in everyday conversations behind tweets, comments, and messages. I awaken in grief for those still fighting the good fight, whose backs buckle under the weight of the colonial, capitalistic, cannibalistic regime, the privilege blinding as the doctrine of discovery moves its way through our knowledges, stories, through our indigenous spirits. My eyes stay open, using the bundles of our ancestors. Nothing can touch us once we learn how to harness, hold heart. Once we learn how to harness Our ancestral power is ours and only ours. A legacy to help us turn around the grief they knew would be coming. Our ancestral power is written in the land and carried by the water. And so, I am grieving, I'm in grief for what I witnessed and for what I saw. And one of the things that Josephine always said was that everything we do now, she always used to go around saying 7 times 7. You need to think 7 times 7. Everything we do now will impact our grandchildren for 7 generations. Every single thing you do, everything, even thoughts, even your thoughts can move forward into the future. And she always used to say, if we discontinue our negligence, we can change things around. And I carry those words at heart, and I will keep on walking, and I will keep on challenging, and I will keep on remembering everything that she and our other elders have given us, our ancestors have left us. I'll keep picking up those bundles of knowledge because I have to have hope. I am a grandmother, right? I have babies. I am going to be an ancestress. So I have to have hope, and I have to have hope that we collectively can discontinue our negligence and change things around. And so I keep walking, and I keep talking, and I keep moving across the landscape in multiple ways to do that, to do my part, even if it's as small as making someone think about the water in a different way, having someone join me on one of the water walks. A lot of the people that came had never walked before. That came on the Saskatchewan River Water Walk, and it's life-changing. It's very, very difficult. It's challenging, but we always open the doors for everyone. As Indigenous nations, I think we've always done that, and because of that hope. And with that, I'll say, Kananaskompton, Miigwech. I'm grateful to creation for each and every one of you for showing up in this space that was created for us to share this evening. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your story, your words with us. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. You can type them in the Q&A. So you've talked about your research as being an inspiration, as inspired by your work, what you do as a water walker.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to be in a room teaching a class and someone in the audience asked you, well, how do you translate this, what you just shared with us, into doing research, what is it that you would say to them?
That how do I well, it is one of the things that we do. I'll just give another example. Because we're moving in this kind of ancestral traditional way, one of the things that occurs, and in all the years that I've been walking in all the places, we're invited into Indigenous communities. And so literally, we were invited almost into every single Indigenous community along the path of the water walks. So for instance, with the Saskatchewan River, we were hosted by various First Nation communities, Indigenous communities. We were hosted by, say, for instance, Musqueam. And once people see that you're walking the talk, that you're not just, and not saying that there's anything wrong. We each have to come to our own way of knowing, but seeing that, I'm not just sequestered in academia, that I'm out making those physical commitments to the lands and the waters, that I'm actively moving across the land, gathering those stories from not only the land itself, but from the people. Because part of what we do as water walkers is we make those connections, right? And so, we had people from host us in what was traditionally known as Small Boys Camp. We had people host us in a traditional way in Musqueam. And so, you don't always get those invitations into those spaces, right? But we're already showing those communities and showing those nations that, I'm here for the water first and foremost, and I'm here for your people. And so what happens is, for instance, they'll bring out their knowledge holders, they'll bring out their storytellers. We'll sit around inside of a teepee, we'll be invited into their ceremonial spaces. They'll show us some of the most sacred sites that aren't known, right? Because they want to protect them. But I know where to get fresh water and where to get water from Matan all the way right through to Alberta now. So that's a method. I guess in Western terms, it would be called participatory research method, maybe. But for us, it's about creating those connections, those relationships. Creating those relationships. And I'm here to serve first and foremost the water and the people. So anything I do in academia has to connect back to the people and to the waters and the land. So anything I produce, I don't make money from being a water walker. We're completely grassroots funded. We don't have a huge, and this last water walk, we paid for everything. So normally, often, when we were with Joba, we would be responsible for everything, our own food and our own vehicles and our own transportation, our own accommodations. But this walk, we had enough funding so that we could cover all of our core water walkers' costs, right? But in exchange, I can't create something that just sits in a library. I have to go back. I have to give back to those communities in some way, shape, or form, whether that's, bringing, and another method might be, we had young people walk with us, young people who may have never thought about their land the way it is thought of through the lens of the water, right? So we had a number of young people join us. And so they carried that water through their own ancestral territory. And as we walk with them, we're sharing the teachings of the water. We've had allies, non-Indigenous people come and walk with us and learn about our relationship with that water through a completely different lens, in a way that they never thought about it before. And so I think that would be one way, or a couple of examples.
Well, I have some questions from the
audience. Yay!
So Anita Basu says, I appreciate the comment of thinking about 7 generations. How do you visualize such a time period?
I have to look into the eyes of my grandchildren. And if you have children and you look into the eyes of your children, that's what I do. I look at my babies and I look at all the babies, all the collective babies, because I think part of the problem is that, that we're seeing in the world is that we have this like, it's about me and just my family, but it isn't. It's about all of the children. So, the way that it's been shared with me is that 7 generations ago, there was an ancestor of yours. And that ancestor was already thinking about you without you even consciously knowing, without them consciously knowing you, because everything they did, every movement they made in the world was for their children or their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren. And I didn't fully conceptualize this until someone put my grandchildren in my arms. When I first carried my son and then I got to carry my grandbabies, it was like a completely different lens opened. And I think it's really important because not everyone chooses to have children. And so I think it's really important to understand that within an Indigenous way of knowing, those relationships are not always biological, right? So you can have siblings who are not related to you. And that's part of what happens when you move through those Indigenous ways of knowing. One of the gifts that I received from the Saskatchewan River Water Walk is I have 9 brothers. Not even kidding. The water gifted me 9 brothers. And, so the way that my cousins their children call me auntie. So we have a different relationality. So I want to extend that to people who are like, well, I don't have any children. Where does that leave me? Well, maybe your best friend has a child, or maybe your sister, or you're an uncle, or you're an auntie. Again, it doesn't need to be biological. You need to have a relationship with a child. And if you have that relationship with a child, you know that you want it to be better for them. You want it to be better for them. It's just this instinct. And so the way that I see it, and I'm lucky, I'm very fortunate that I can trace my ancestors back 7 generations because they left me the means to do that. They left their tracks in the sand, as we say in the Medewan Lodge. So I was able to find exactly where and who I come from. And that's something I'm doing. I'm leaving tracks. Like I'm leaving tracks physically, digitally, marks in the landscape, and I'm leaving tracks through those relationships. So, my great granddaughter can go through Musqueam and there'll be a story. There'll be a story about the water walkers coming through their territory. And so she'll be able to say, my Kukum was one of those water walkers. Right. And so it's really about the way we relate to each other. And I love my future generations, 7 generations and beyond, without a shadow of a doubt. I love them already. I don't need to know them to love them. And I know that 7 generations behind me and behind you, there was someone like me who held on to their grandchild and was like, oh my goodness, everything I do is going to be for them. Yeah.
I hear you. My kids have lots of aunties and uncles.
Right.
Yeah. I have a question from someone who decided not to put their name down. Thank you for your beautiful knowledge and presentation. How can non-Indigenous stewardship groups begin to do a better job of inviting Indigenous participation and/or sharing traditional knowledge?
Well, I think looking at the way the Junction Creek Stewardship Committee partnered, right? It's about partnerships, right? I think there needs to be that understanding that if you're inviting Indigenous people in, again, it's the same thing with institutions, right? If you're wanting to indigenize, if you're wanting us to come in to occupy those spaces, you have to give us that equality, right? You have to give us that, the authority to bring that knowledge in the way that we see. And it can be very uncomfortable sometimes. It can lead to, there's some uncomfortable, painful conversations that are had between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And sometimes those learning curves are really, really steep for both parties. But if the heart and the intent is there, people will work. We're again, Indigenous people across Turtle Island are like waving those red flags, saying, you know what, we have to do something different. We have to do something different because it's going to impact us all. Like, we need as many allies as we can get. And so I always tell people to approach it from a partnership, from a space of equality, or even saying, the way Junction Creek, and I loved working with them because they let me do what I needed to do, but they gave me the platform to support the work. They didn't try to control, they didn't try to dictate. They support, what can we do and how can we do it? And so that consultation and that genuine partnership occurred from beginning to end, right? And it was really powerful. It was really powerful. So there's spaces for that to occur, but I think the very first, most important one is to approach people with that genuine intent and with that partnership in place, like saying, we're coming we want you as not only as partners, but we want you to take the lead on this. How can we partner with you? And depending on who you ask, they'll define for themselves what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Celine asks, you articulated the water carries the memories of our ancestors who are with us, Masi Cho, because it tells me the water can heal our nations.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, our feet carry memories or can become Indigenous research methodology as an embodied knowledge. Can you say a little bit about that, please?
Yes. And thank you, Celine. Celine is my peer at Trent in the PhD program. So I know her. So good to hear from you. And embodying the earth and the land and those spaces that our ancestors were in. When we think about that again, water, and I mean, it's both this exciting instrumental thought that you, in order to create, so let me back up. In order to experience that knowledge, you have to create the relationship with the body, right? So you have to create the relationship with your own body, but also with the body of water or land, right? Because in Indigenous ways, our ways of knowing, we conceptualize that water as a living entity. And so, if a total stranger came up to you and said, hey, what can I get from you? Like, what can I take from you? And that's been our mistake as humans. We have failed to enter into reciprocal relationships with the lands and water. Some of us are coming into consciousness. So before you can even enter that water at another level, you have to enter into a relationship with her. And that's one of the ways, one of the things that the water walk does is it allows that water to see us and to know us, because we're singing and we're talking to the water, we're stopping. We're making offerings, we lay down tobacco at every single body of water that we pass, right? Think about that. We give offerings the way that our ancestors have told us. In some of those places, they were like, you can imagine they'd never been, they may never have had that offering made, because that knowledge has been interrupted, the way that we move. And so you have to enter into a relationship first. And from that non-Indigenous way of knowing the world, and we saw this on the water walk. We saw hundreds of people, flocking to the mountains, climbing all over them, sticking, like hammering their nails. We saw them admiring the beauty of the landscape. But when I stopped and talked and I said, what are you giving back? What are you giving back? Like, you're taking, right? You're climbing all over those grandfathers. Like, that's what we conceptualize the mountains as, grandfathers and grandmothers, like those old ones. You're climbing all over them. You're taking pleasure from them. Same with the water. You're diving into her. You're riding your boats on top of her. You're taking. You're fishing. You're sunbathing. You're doing all of this activity. But what are you giving back? Are you cleaning up? You go by the water? Do you see a pile of garbage? Do you walk by it, or do you pick it up? That's one simple way to give back. Once you enter into that relationship, the water will know you. The water will know you, and that water, because the water holds the memories of our ancestors. And I can't get into it in this space, but it unlocks so much, just like it unlocked those 7 children, right? That was the water, right? The water brought me to that fast, which brought me to those children, which connected, from 2017 to finally doing the water walk in 2021, right? That knowing spanned all those years, but it all connected together in this really deep and profound way. And that's because I'd already entered into I'd already walked for that water. In 2015, I'd already done that work. So you have to do the work, and then that water or that land will give back to you, right? Yeah.
We have a few more minutes left, and I wanted to know, would you be willing to take one more question?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, for sure.
So Mira asks, she says, thank you for this inspiring presentation. Says, how do you incorporate Indigenous methodologies such as dreams and ancestral visits into the primary methodologies governing Western academic culture today? In other words, many of us urge our students to leave their traditions aside in coursework in favor of other kinds of data.
Yeah. And that's the crux. That's the difference between an Indigenous way of being and knowing in the world and a non-Indigenous way of being. For us, there is no separation. There can't be a separation. I mean, I guess there can be. You could be if you chose to be. But, we're at a state of being in the world where that system hasn't worked. It isn't working. And so I think, having, one of the people that I'd recommend, to study is Dr. Jim Dumont. Jim Dumont has some beautiful work in this, but he talks about how, as Indigenous people, like, to ask us to leave that is like leaving our spirit behind, right? And our ways of knowing are as valid as researchers. I mean, I guess someone could have spent years in the archives finding those children and right, but there's something missing in the world, and Dr. Dumont argues that it's the spirit. That we've been asked to divorce ourselves from the spirit for far too long. And, I think we're proof. Indigenous societies, we we kept this world pretty good. We kept this part of the world pretty, it was really well done. Like, we had no need for jail systems. We had, there was no pollution. We could drink from every single body of water we could take. And I asked people, when's the last time you took a drink from the land? Would you go outside right now and scoop up some water from the nearest water body to you? Most people are like, never. I would never drink from that river. I'd never drink from this water. And there was a point when we could, as Indigenous people, because it wasn't contaminated. And so, there's something to be said for bringing that spirit in and allowing us as Indigenous people, and even non-Indigenous students. I think, there is a space for us to bring who we are into those spaces. Like I said, it's not always comfortable and it's not always easy. And sometimes it's really hard to make that cross-cultural translation. But I think it can be done. I really do believe that it can be done in a good way. But yeah, I don't know if that answered the question or not.
I think so. I think what you did actually is just open the door to the possibilities, right? I think that's what your words and your perceptions share. So all of this has been very inspiring to I'm sure all of our viewers, myself included. You've set the bar really high in terms of other visiting scholars who come, right?
Well, and I think there's, before we end, I'll say there is a difference. I've been thinking about this and thinking about this and thinking about this, and I'm really grateful to have the Ānako Indigenous Research Institute be a genuine space within academia, because there is a difference being Indigenous grassroots academic, right? Than an Indigenous academic or an academic in Indigenous studies, because ultimately, I answer to my people, and I answer to my elders, and I answer to my lodge, if they, and so it's a different kind of academia, because we're drawing upon our own institutions, and we're allowing people, in some ways, entryways into that way of knowing. We're extending that invitation, I guess. Whether it's come join us on a water walk, or think about, inviting someone to your territory and bringing those water teachings to your community, or, come to our lodges, or come to our longhouses, like whatever it is, right? That invitation is for you to enter into our way of knowing. And someone who's connected to community is going to move in a different way. Like, we have to have those community. And again, I'm saying that within an Indigenous context, we could have an urban community, we can have a res community, we can have a spiritual community, but it has to be those connections. We can't operate in alone, so to speak. And so that accountability and that relationality is pivotal to us, and very important within the context of Indigenous research and Indigenous research methods. And so, yeah. Well, so I just think I'm totally a grassroots academic. So I always approach things from that perspective. And sometimes it alienates me within the scope of academia, but sometimes it opens doors too. And I've had many people join us, because of it. So thank you again. And thank you for creating this space. It's really, I can't even begin to express what an honor it's been to have, to be able to be who I am, and have that understood.
Wonderful.
And supported. Yeah.
This is great. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you on behalf of the team. at Ānako, on behalf of Carleton University, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you in the audience for joining us tonight. Stay tuned. Tasha will be doing a talk in November, one in January, one in February, and March on different subjects. So she still has lots more to say. So tune in, pay attention to our Facebook page and our website, which is carleton.ca/Ānako.
Yeah. And just a hint, I'm thinking I think the next one is on Indigenous masculinities. So should be interesting.
This will be great. So thank you. Thank you, Julie, for putting this on, helping.
No problem. Thank you, Tasha. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Julie. It's been awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to all our participants who came and hang out. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone. See you later.